Hello all, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's Common Ground. I'm Anya, the events assistant here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and the privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Erika R, Knierim, Sarah C, Odenkirk, and Charlotte Kent. We're thrilled to welcome poet Matthea Harvey here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges that Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we are on Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions, which I will post shortly. And now to introduce today's guests and host. Erika Knierim is an attorney, finance professional, and creative consultant. She founded Nomic Consulting in 2021 to assist artists and collectors starting their journey into the complex but exciting world of NFTs and blockchain. Sarah C. Odenkirk is a partner at CDAS and co-heads the Art Law and NFT Practice Group. She has been practicing in the art world for more than 25 years and in the blockchain space since 2018, representing a wide variety of clients as they pursue their innovative and creative ventures. And Assistant Professor of Visual Culture, Charlotte Kent, PhD, has a particular interest in historical frameworks for assorted practices, digital culture, and the absurd. She writes for assorted magazines and publishes her research in various academic journals, and she is an editor at large for the Brooklyn Rail. So without further ado, please, Charlotte, take it away.
Thank you so much. So to get us started a little bit, blockchain seems to propose that it's a trustless system, and in that sense, fairer than the one we currently have. Its main attributes of decentralization and immutability, as well as transparency and anonymity, are supposed to contribute to that, but it's not always clear to me how. I've already begun to introduce some vocabulary, and there's a lot of language around blockchain that is confusing. Analogies are produced, I'm sure we will do some today, but they sometimes confuse more because they're inexact. That being said, I'd remind us all that the art world is also known for its art speak. Today, I'm thrilled to have Erika and Sarah here today. They're two lawyers to help us unpack some of this language and its implications, as well as point out some legal uncertainties in this blockchain landscape. Now, I realize that for some, lawyers represent intermediaries and a regulatory system that has failed us. I could, of course, point out that in a post-capitalist society, there is no system that hasn't failed us, but more to the point, I think that they have an area of expertise that can help us begin to understand how the designs of blockchain platforms and practices are more nuanced than they at first appear, and how their claims require greater scrutiny. Both have also worked alongside artists in developing complex projects, so they not only understand the legal side of things, but get the ins and outs of a studio practice and the nifty landscape. I had someone say to me that I couldn't have picked 3 more confounding topics in art law and blockchain for a talk, and I can only assure you it's going to get worse because we're probably going to talk about finance too. Of course, I need to be very, very clear. Nothing said today constitutes legal or financial advice. The discussion is meant to identify some places for you to continue to investigate your participation in this ecosystem. Blockchain is here to stay. Even if you don't engage with NFTs, the technology will be present in other parts of our lives. Understanding how it works, what is being debated and developed today, will help us encourage decisions that make it a more equitable space for all soon. So with that, if I may, thank you, Erika and Sarah, for joining.
Thanks for having us.
I thought we might just get started with smart contracts because it is a space that so much conversation is around. People have a lot of questions around it. At its most basic, if I understand correctly, a smart contract is a bit of code that automates an outcome based on a trigger. Now, smart contracts have been touted for their ability to get rid of legal contracts, but I don't understand how a smart contract would be able to be written to deal with every possible eventuality. So can they actually eliminate the need for legal contracts? And if they can't, what is their purpose from your perspective?
Erika, do you want to take that first?
I'm going to kick this first portion over to you, actually, as the contract lawyer in the room.
So smart contracts are not going to be able to replace all contracts for sure. In fact, I have consistently said that, smart contracts is really, it's the word itself is a misnomer in that there's very little in the smart contract that's actually contractual. It's true that there is this triggering event that happens for the transaction. And of course, the big thing that everyone talks about, I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more as we get into our conversation, is this issue of resale royalties. And that's a really important and exciting aspect of this, but that doesn't make the entire written portion of this a contract. What it is essentially is code that's attached to the blockchain that dictates that actually is the NFT, right? This is actually the core of the NFT. Within the metadata that's in that smart contract, and that's really what it is some metadata, there are links to other things. So for artwork, you've got a link, generally speaking, you've got a link to either someplace like IPFS or Arweave, and that's where you'll actually have the image that's where it sits, and the metadata points to that. There are some NFTs that include the artwork itself within the metadata, but for most cases, it would just be way too much information to have there and too expensive to store it on the blockchain. So quick answer, smart contracts are not contracts. And I think that's the whole point of this conversation today. And what I'm going to continue to say over and over again, probably to the point of sounding like a broken record, is that in order to really have terms associated with NFTs, we have to have documents that separately articulate those intentions and desires attached to the metadata in the same way that you would attach the artwork.
So thank you for that, Sarah, because I think it's important, right? Smart contracts aren't in fact contracts. And if I may, I've even heard you use the word armature around them to think of them that way. So just before I move on to the next question, and because I want to talk a little bit more about this metadata and what you're talking about, like including other things in there and so forth, can you just tell us specifically what about the word armature appeals to you and why you think it better communicates what is happening here?
Yeah, I mean, I sought for a long time, like, what's a better word than smart contract? Because as a contracts lawyer, I was so offended by the term smart contract. And armature did seem to me to make some sense in terms of it being the structure for something, right? It's the structure onto which we hang other things in order to give it meaning and create the actual NFT. I mean, the metadata itself is the NFT. That's what gets transferred. That's what gives you whatever ownership rights or access to the other content. So it really is just a very simple structure onto which we can put other things. Now, that said, I do think, and this is something else that we'll get into, and I know Erika has a lot to say on this as well, there's a tremendous amount of potential for that code. There's a tremendous amount of potential for things that could be written into those smart contracts or armatures. Some of it has to do right now with the fact that it's very expensive to do those custom bespoke contracts. And so we're talking about a question of balancing cost and efficiency with technological abilities. But, so I think in the future, we're going to see much more sophistication within that metadata. But for now, really our only solution to including real terms is to attach those separately.
Okay, so why don't we jump into that a little bit more then? And maybe we'll get back to some of these sort of some of the platform smart contracts as we proceed in the conversations and the sort of pros and cons around them later on. Because I think, we've been talking enough about the metadata, it's worth sort of investigating what its potential is. Most NFTs point to media off-chain, right? So the work is located elsewhere. Now, there are some conceptual projects that use the blockchain itself. I'm going to put those to the side and really just for this question, look specifically at ones that point elsewhere. Now, I have two sort of weird questions around this because of the way you talked about potentiality. If it's a web-based work, couldn't the artist alter what exists at the URL? In other words, if what is being pointed at is a URL, right, then that could stay the same, but what is there could potentially change. And so I'm just wondering, you know, with these kinds of infrastructures in place, are there ways to sort of cement that? And as a part of probably having to get into this, since I suspect we're going to talk about IPFS, what are the benefits and drawbacks of using that system?
So you've brought up a number of different things, and I think that what's important to understand is that the way that the NFT structure works, obviously in an ideal world, is that you can't actually change the content that it's pointing to. You may have problems with that link at some point, but assuming it's been properly set up, you're not going to be able to change really anything unless you've left a back door in to allow you to do that. So, you know, there are all these caveats like unless. And the fact is that it's very difficult for your average consumer to figure out what is, you know, contained within that metadata and what the structure is. And now we're starting to see a lot more articles coming out about, hey, my NFT disappeared, or the link broke and it's something else. And so there are problems because so much of the system right now is held together with Band-Aids and bubblegum. And I think that that's something that we need to really be paying attention to. You know, I'm not a coder, I am not a developer, so my knowledge of the technical side is very limited. My experience is in drafting contracts and working in the fine art world. And so I come to this from that perspective. So my focus has been, how do we articulate actually what's being sold and purchased and collected and transacted in a way that's understandable to most people? And, you know, again, throwing so many different issues into the mix, so much of the challenge right now is that user interface and how do people interact with this system, and how do they know what they're buying? How do they know what they're transacting? How do artists know what they're creating when they're not actually drafting that metadata themselves and putting it onto the blockchain themselves?
So are there things that you encourage people to look at in terms of when they're, because they're dealing with a marketplace native smart contract, or because they're not personally involved in developing the system? Are there things that you recommend that they look at, that they look for? Are there things that are warnings, either for artists or collectors? Potentially, it could go. This question really applies to either.
So you've brought up enough questions that we could probably talk about that for the next 10 hours. There's so much there to unpack, and I know I should let Erika hop in and address some of those as well, because I think she's got some advice that she gives to the people she works with. I have a lot of different questions for people when they come to me with an NFT project. From the standpoint of artists, my question is why? Why do you want to create something in this space? And, you know, I mean, it's perfectly legitimate to say, I want to make money. And so if that's the question, if you want to make money, then the next question would be like, do you want this to be sustainable work that you're creating, or are you just looking to put something up there, make some money, and you don't care what happens to it after that? And I think by default, unfortunately, that's a lot of what has been happening for artists, because they don't really know how to code. They don't really understand what the blockchain is. They don't understand how these things are structured. And so they're offered through a platform, they're offered this opportunity, hey, give us your content, we'll make you an NFT, it'll be there, you can sell it, you get all these wonderful things. It's very difficult to check those claims out sometimes, especially if you don't know what to look for. It's also difficult to enforce those promises. Who are you going to sue? What are you going to do if if it doesn't come through? So I think it's important for artists particularly to understand why it is they're entering the NFT space. Why do you want to be engaged with the blockchain? And make sure that there's some understanding as to what the goals are there. In terms of the other side, collectors, it's all so changing and fast moving. If you're not somebody who's been in the space of collecting digital art already, again, understanding why do you want to be in that space? Are you looking for quick cash? Are you looking to flip things? If you're approaching it from a purely speculative perspective, okay, I get it. That's so much of what's out there right now, for sure. But you have to understand that that's why you're engaging. If you're engaging as a serious collector or as an institution that's coming to the space and trying to figure out, what does this mean for art? What does this mean for collections, for institutions, for donations? Then there's a whole other set of considerations that need to be made in terms of the health and sustainability of that structure that makes up the NFT that's being collected.
Every time,
And
okay, I was
sorry,
gonna
go
say,
ahead.
Erica, please go
And
ahead.
that's
Every
where
time, every time I talk to them, anything they say just raises more questions for me, right? But please, Erica, go ahead.
And I think this is that point where I can come in and say, those questions, why are you doing it, raise the question of risk. Because I think a lot of artists and a lot of collectors want to get into this space. And when you talk about risk in this space, you have to talk about trust. And I think trust is this misnomer. Is this a great sort of moment to get into this, Charlotte, the trust component of it? Because I think there's this idea, just like smart contracts aren't contracts, the trustless nature of blockchain or decentralized ledger technology is not, in fact, trustless. I think that there's this belief system because people have talked about it as a trustless system, but that trustless word came from a place that has nothing to do with the overall ecosystem that is built around it. And I think when we take a look at this, we have to parse out the types of trust that are involved. We have personal trust. This is the trust that human beings have with one another. This is the type of trust that we've worked within as a structure for hundreds of years. And then on the other side of this, you have systems trust. And as we have technology an increasingly large part of our lives, we have to trust in those systems in order to operate on a day-to-day basis. And you look at things like Uber. When you go to the Uber app and you order a car, and you hope that that car comes up, you hope that that driver has insurance. You have to trust that that platform has reviewed that person's history, that they are a safe driver, that that car is going to operate, and that you're going to get to the destination. That driver has to trust that he's going to get that money. If you look at the blockchain in that system, there's a deep, deep systems trust that we have to be involved in. And every single aspect of what Sarah said talks about how an artist or a collector has to have that deep systems trust from the beginning to the end. For example, when we talk about the blockchain itself, the blockchain was created by a series of coders who created protocols. Who are those coders and developers? What is their experience? How can we trust that they built something that is going to do what they say it's going to do? And this may bring up later on in conversations like DAOs. You know, the original DAO raised a lot of questions into whether or not the code that was in the actual DAO was trustable, because there was a small sort of loophole that allowed for a massive theft to take place. So when we build the blockchain, there's trust there. When you create a wallet, do you remember the passwords for your wallet? Where are they kept? Do you trust the people that you share that information with? When you mint an NFT as an artist, who are the coders and developers that you're working with? Are they people who just sort of got into this space because it was a place for opportunity, or they have a deep well of experience? Lawyers, do they know that you cannot put those contracts into, I mean, if you see where I'm going, every single aspect of this has trust in these systems, but those are also aspects that are the disintermediation that blockchain allows.
So
and
I
when
wonder,
you
Erica, hold
sure,
on. I'm just wondering if I can just jump in here for a second, because I think that, you know, getting into the conversation around trust gets into the notion that because of power, right, in human systems, the trustless notion was supposed to be able to obviate some of that so that it was a more equal playing field, right? This was this notion of fairness that I introduced at the beginning, and is, at least in principle, part of what a fair market is supposed to be enabling. But to your point, there has to be trust in the code. And we know, not only from the context of blockchain, but from a number of other systems, that code itself is developed by people. It includes various different kinds of biases and so forth. But what I'm really interested in, what you're talking about, is the way in which, in order to actually engage with the system, it sounds like there's already a huge number of intermediaries. And one of the things that I think gets touted a lot about blockchain is disintermediation, which is what you were just getting into, Erika. This notion that somehow suddenly, because the blockchain is a peer-to-peer network, that somehow we as individuals have access to this kind of one-to-one interaction. But who hosts the wallet? What platform are you using? Even coin exchanges themselves, right, are actually exchanges. There's something there that's a centralizing intermediating body. I guess I'm sort of off here from a moment from the art thing, but I guess one of the things that as that gets increasingly complicated, it starts to seem as if, well, gosh, it seems like we do need advisors, and maybe we do need curators, and maybe we do need lawyers, and it reintroduces intermediaries. So I guess in the context of, what it is where this ecosystem is currently and where it is that we want it to go in terms of minimizing some of the power structures and minimizing some of the intermediaries, how nevertheless can we introduce intermediaries into the space so that it is a healthy ecosystem, right? One that allows trust for humans, allows for trust for systems.
I think that's, again, as Sarah pointed out, such a complex question, because when we talk about intermediaries and we talk about power systems and disintermediation, we have to think about, okay, what level do you want to engage with this technology? It is possible for an artist to learn how to code. I work with a coder who also has an artist who also has a degree in computer science. So when he's looking at these smart contracts and the code that's underlying them, he can have an educated eye about that. So there's this idea of the possibility of being a Renaissance man or woman. And when you approach this technology, you can do that. But it's a time cost perspective, an opportunity cost perspective, that when you spend your time learning how to code, you're missing out on the opportunity to focus on art. So I think when an artist decides to interact with this ecosystem, they have to make a personal decision about how involved they want to get, how educated and informed they want to get. And that will show in the ways that their art sort of survives over generations. And I think when we talk about this space in general, I think the art world is particularly well suited to think about these items for what they are, which is true multi-generational permanent items, so long as the blockchains survive. And again, this comes back to this level of trust that these systems will continue to be there. So when we talk about re-intermediation, I think what we can do is ask ourselves, when a player comes into the space, and I use the Uber technology again, and the Uber example of, you have two people on each side, a person who needs a ride and a person who has a car. And Uber created that disintermediation so we didn't have to go through cab companies, and provided a platform to connect to these individuals. If we see blockchain in a way as those two things, re-intermediation should be from people who participate or facilitate that transaction in a way that makes sure that that artist is protected, and that that art survives for as long as they want it to survive, and that that contract is doing what you want it to do. So when you ask yourself, what people do I want in that process? Perhaps you do want to work with a curator, or maybe you don't. Perhaps you want to work with, perhaps you absolutely should work with a lawyer. And a little bit later, we'll talk about the types of lawyers, because I think securities are a huge question in this space, especially when you talk about fractionalized ownership or royalties in a secondary marketplace. The securities, the SEC and the IRS are looking at these very carefully. So there are re-intermediations that are necessary to protect yourself as an artist. But there are some that I think will fall by the wayside.
I also think it's really important to understand that simply by saying that you don't want to have intermediaries or you don't want to have regulation doesn't mean that there aren't systems developing behind the scenes that are essentially doing that. So this whole idea that there's this decentralized system that everybody can have equal ownership in, and this whole notion of Web3, which is really appealing, is only as good as you can actually connect in that Web3 environment. And if what's actually happening is, while we're all trying to figure out how it actually works and where is the blockchain and who runs it and all these different questions, we at the same time have systems that are developing that are potentially predatory systems, or potentially unhealthy systems, or potentially systems that are not designed to provide equal access and and a fair shot at participating in this new Web3 environment. So I think that really understanding what is and is not happening today is very important. And if we have unhealthy systems that are being put in place and underlie the landscape at this point, those systems are going to endure, and it's going to be problematic. You don't even want to put healthy on top of unhealthy. We've got to make sure that the foundation is solid.
So I'm going to put a pin in one aspect of this conversation that I just want to bring up very, very briefly, because of course, some of what you're talking about when you bring into Web3 has to do with interoperability, right? And there are issues with interoperability that have to do with how it is that data from one chain can connect with another. APIs are both inefficient and have security risks, but because of all of this desire for interoperability, there's this notion that maybe we need standards, right? And maybe that there needs to be a network of networks and so on. And so there's these ways in which I'm just, laying this out as something before we move on. But there's these ways in which, as these systems develop, in order for them to be actually we want them to be, and interoperability is one of those features, we need to be aware of what that means in terms of the larger ecosystem. I want to put a pin in that.
Okay.
Well, just because that is its own whole massive road down that we could go down. And I wanted to mention it simply because I think for our audience, it's important just to think of that as like a concrete example of something we want, but that has massive implications. So I want to back up just for a moment, and then we'll move forward again. Because you both have already brought up resale royalty rights. And I think this is something that is just like, celebrated all over the place. Everyone is talking about it, right? Hooray, hurrah. And by all means, resale royalty rights are changing the landscape. The fact that the nifty marketplaces themselves have this often like instituted within their native smart contracts is significant. It suggests a change across the board, right? But one of the questions that I had about resale royalties is that they're often presented as some kind of like welfare system for artists, right? Like, oh, it'll be great. The poor starving artists will keep making money. And I understand that, but it seems as if with this technology, it would also be possible for resale royalties to become a type of property. In other words, an artist could potentially sell some portion of the resale rights that they have. They could potentially pool them into an investment fund or something. Like, it seems as if there's potential for the resale royalty to also become a kind of property. And I'm just wondering if that changes how we understand resale royalties.
I think that it's important to understand that the concept of resale royalties has existed for quite some time, right? So even in the traditional art world, there's been a long-standing conversation around resale royalties. Europe, of course, has recognized them for a long time. The United States, not so much. And we've got the Sigala-Prajansky contract from the 70s, which was attempted to be integrated into the traditional art world. Didn't really work so well, but they laid the foundation. And now there are people who are pushing hard for that same kind of respect. There's the artist contract website that's working on these things. So there's a lot of conversation just outside of anything that has to do with NFTs and the web. The thing that is so innovative and exciting about being able to build it into this NFT structure is that it happens automatically. There's no one, you don't have to get the legislature to pass a law. You don't have to chase after galleries and collectors in order to get the money. It happens automatically. I know you said you wanted to set aside the issue of interoperability, but this is a really important point for the resale royalties conversation, which is that without interoperability, there's no guarantee that that resale royalty that's built into the metadata is going to be recognized if you take the NFT from one platform and move it to another. Not to mention a whole host of other ways in which people can get around the resale royalty provisions. So yes, I mean, theoretically, there's something valuable there that you could tokenize and get other people involved in investing in. But first, you have to have something that's reliable enough that it would make sense for anyone to invest in it. So what I start to get very nervous about, and Erika brought up the issue of SEC and other regulatory issues that do need to be taken into consideration. At what point does it become too much of a pyramid scheme for anybody to tolerate? Like there's there are levels on levels on levels in terms of trying to monetize and fractionalize and financialize all of these aspects of this NFT market. A lot of that has to do with taking advantage of people who don't really understand what underlies the artwork, the technology, the system. And so that makes me nervous, and I'll leave it there before I go on for the rest of our time.
Well, I'm going to step in and talk about the SEC component of this because I think it's 100% essential to this conversation. Earlier last year in April, Arcanis Capital LLC petitioned the SEC to publish a concept release on the regulation of NFTs because there is no sort of guidance. The SEC has dabbled in cryptocurrency, but NFTs they've been a lot more silent. And I think there was the DAO is to refer to something I mentioned earlier. The DAO was a project a couple of years ago, and the SEC actually determined that sort of fractionalized ownership structure was in fact a security or a securitization of these objects. And so I want to talk about just a little bit under the Howey test, which is basically the sort of standard for whether or not something is a security. It's an investment of money in a common enterprise with the expectation that profits will be derived from the efforts of a promoter or a third party. Now, as it relates to NFT, I think that we can, let's say, for example, just to pick a name out of a hat, we had a release of something called Crypto Dudes. And let's just say randomly that this, there were 10,000 of those that were released, and the company co-founders reserved 1,000 of them for themselves. Well, now they have majority owner. If they are the ones who own the majority in one centralized wallet of the options for fractionalization of the entirety of the pool, if that's the case, and let's say, for example, later on that company was contacted by people who want to turn that into a media empire through movies and films and video games. Now you're talking about them involved in the rise of the price of these instruments or these fractionalizations or these NFTs as a whole, but they own the majority of those objects. When they own 10% of what is available on the marketplace, then they have a vested interest in that fractionalization or that piece going up in value. And that's where it gets really, really murky, because the SEC in other spaces where the structure was that same structure where one majority owner was doing things to make the value of everything rise, and they were getting reversionary interests in this, that those were securities. Now, there's no straight answer to that. The SEC has not spoken about this. They have not released that opinion paper, but it's something that every single NFT creator and community creator should be aware of, because every community I've seen in the NFT space that's not a DAO retains reversionary interests for the creators and the community, sort of the powers of the community, powers that be, to get reversionary interest for every subsequent sale. So just be aware of that. Keep an eye on what the SEC is saying in that department. It doesn't mean you can't do it. It doesn't mean that I'm saying NFTs will die. I'm just saying that might include the necessity to hire a securities attorney to make sure that what you're doing is on an exchange that is established as a broker dealer. Again, these are infrastructures that aren't even in place yet, and we are stress testing at this time. But I will point out that ignorance of the law is not a defense. And whether or not the SEC will go after a small guy is one thing, but when you've got, large communities like CryptoPunks, for example, that are worth millions and millions of dollars, that's no longer a small community. And the SEC is very likely to look at those areas.
I think what this really brings up is the need to pay attention to the articulation of intentions around what it is we're doing. And so that gets us back to this issue of contracts. And if we don't have an articulation of what the project is, even if we're just going to go back to, and Erika, you're 100% right about all of these potential securities issues, but just looking at the individual artist and the desire to create a work of art that can be sold in a different situation than what we're looking at, in the traditional art world. And if we don't have an articulation that protects artists within the smart contract or the armature, where does that come up? Where do we have that language that can articulate and protect, or at least inform, whether it's the artists who are creating the work or anybody who's engaging in purchasing? And I think it's important to look at a couple of different areas. And Charlotte, this gets back to one of your original questions about what do I tell people who are interested in engaging here? There are basically 3 different buckets that I'm thinking of right now as to where some of this language happens or can be put. The first bucket would be on the platform or website or marketplace, wherever it is that you're, the user facing portion of this relationship. You often have terms and conditions or terms of service, something that articulates the intentions around the people offering whatever it is they're selling on that platform or in that marketplace, and the rights that may or may not go with that engagement. Those are really important, and that has actually brought up a lot of really interesting challenges and problems, and I think it's an area that we're going to see a lot of conversation and conflict around this year. So if you look at projects like Bored Apes, where they have some commercial rights that they articulate within their terms of service, how that's being interpreted is still yet to be seen. They've made some commentary around some parameters, but we have to see what the owners actually do in terms of creating derivative works to see where are those friction points, where do the tensions come up with that sort of broad licensing ability. Looking at something like Junkyard Dogs, where there are some restrictions on the type of derivative works that can be created, or CryptoKitties, where it's a matter of how much money you can earn every year. So those are all within the terms of service on that user-facing marketplace website side. And then you've got your NFT. The second bucket is the NFT itself, which is what we're here talking about today, which is that metadata piece, which has not a whole lot of information in it. It has some fields that are filled in with some information about the creator, the description of the work, the number of works that are being sold, the value, those transactional issues. And then you've got the third bucket, which is all the stuff that's attached to the metadata. And that's the information that lives on a separate, decentralized, hopefully, network, or it could be on the artist's own servers. That's actually something we discussed beforehand, this article, the Moxie article, and I don't know, Anya, if you can pop that into the chat, that would be an interesting one for people to take a look at. One of the important conclusions there is that people don't want to host their own servers. And so then you get into the expense and the impact it has on accessibility if you're required to build your own infrastructure every time you want to create an NFT. Those are all issues that need to be considered. But again, we have essentially these three buckets, these three areas where some of this articulation can happen. We need to be paying attention to all of them at the same time and understand how they interact with one another and figure out how do we build a healthy system that allows for NFTs that are meaningful, sustainable, and accessible in the way that we're all talking about wanting them to be.
Wow, thank you. I think those three buckets are really important ones to recognize. It is, if you haven't browsed a lot of nifty platforms, and some of you have, and some of you maybe have not, you'll be surprised often how some of them have shockingly little information about them. So little information that would be unacceptable in almost any other situation, and yet still people get involved, right? So it is something, to look into at the most basic level. But in this world of, since we're back to the sort of smart contract, I want to ask, I want to ask about the degree to which it's really immutable. It is my understanding that you can, in fact, update a smart contract. And in fact, it seems like this would be desirable because, say, in terms of the splits or something that, a person or an organization no longer exists, you would maybe want to update what to do with that, that portion of funds. Or there might be other things that come up in the normal way that things come up that require re-examining a normal paper, tangible letter of agreement to update terms and so forth. So to what degree are smart contracts, in fact, updatable in this way? And is it only the artist who can do that? And if so, is that something that a collector needs to be aware of and concerned about?
So the answer to this question is the same answer that I give to all complicated legal questions, which is, it depends. It really depends on the way that that smart contract is built, the way that the metadata is coded, the way that, that whole coding piece is created. And so, sure, it's possible to create an NFT that is not immutable, that is mutable, that can be changed. And that's something that, I don't know how people would figure that. Your average consumer of NFTs, how are they going to figure that out? I don't know. I think that this is a really important question because, initially the headlines were, oh, all you're buying is a JPEG. Well, maybe, but I mean, you're buying something that is much more complicated than a JPEG, first of all, and you don't even know what it is you're buying unless you can read the code or unless you have somebody there to interpret it for you. The purpose of some projects is to have a mutable project, to have a changing project, whether that's a generative art project or something where the artist is allowed to go in and change the work. Presumably you would, in an ideal world, you would have an agreement between the artist and the collector so that the collector knows that that's the way that this is structured and they're agreeing to it. So again, it comes down to that contractual relationship. If you don't have a meeting of the minds, you don't have a contract. But if you don't have a meeting of the minds, like it makes that transaction very complicated and suspect. So I think that the simple answer is that yes, I mean, a lot of these things are changeable and they are not as secure as we're all being told that they are. And you really have to dig in and understand what underlies what it is you're purchasing in order to really know the answer to those questions. It also does depend on which platform you're talking about. So, there's been a lot of conversation around where the minting occurs, where the creation of that NFT occurs. Does it happen in the artist's wallet? Does the artist actually have control over that NFT from the beginning? Oftentimes the answer is no. If you're going to a platform uploading the material and it's being minted for you, even if it's even being minted at all, right? It may be that it's not even really actually being put on the blockchain and there's this internal system that's being used. So understanding the way that different platforms work, what it means for who the creator is, what it means for who can make changes or not make changes, is something, again, that people really have rushed in and not given a lot of thought to, but it is absolutely imperative that this be a topic of conversation and concern as we move forward so that, we are hopefully building a series of systems that are sustainable and support the artists in that creative work.
I also want to add to that there are two levels of immutability that we need to be aware of, and that's the smart contract immutability and the blockchain immutability. And this brings me back to a really sort of famous example of the Parity Multisig hack, which happened in 2017. And Parity was a company that was founded by Gavin Wood. He was the founder and chief technology officer. He has, and this is important, a master's in computer science and software engineering, a PhD in computer science, and he was also a co-founder of Ethereum. And when creating Parity, unbeknownst to the coders, the original developers, who there cannot be a more sort of qualified group of developers, there was a problem. And the initial problem was fixed with an update. And that update had another bug or problem with it. A random sort of user made them aware of that problem. And they thought that this was a suggestion and not a real problem. So they didn't really address it. And then an Ethereum self-described novice who went by DevOps 199, saw this vulnerability, gained control of the Parity Multisig wallet library by making himself the owner, and executed a self-destruct command that froze all of those wallets. Now, in today's value, $1.68 billion worth of Ethereum is now frozen. And when that happened, the Parity creators, or the people in the Parity community, reached out to Ethereum and said we should do what's called a hard fork. And a hard fork is basically a rewriting of the blockchain. And when you rewrite that blockchain, that negates the immutability of the blockchain. It basically is the opposite of what that blockchain is supposed to do. And so when they reached out to the Ethereum community actually said no. And up until now, they have been refused to rewrite that code, and all of those wallets are still to this day frozen. So there's other instances of this, and one of the more recent examples was just a few weeks ago.
Well, okay, but hold on, Erika.
Sure.
I just want to jump in here because I think that's a really good example. But I also, I think what's at stake that you're trying to point out is the fact that when we talk about immutability, the way the word gets thrown around is as if the entire system is entirely immutable, and that actually there are aspects of the system that are immutable, and that part of the way to understand immutability might mean that there is a transparent record of all the transactions and events, not that the practice of transaction can't be changed. Right. So like there's a couple different, that it's worth sort of splitting up how immutability is applied. I want to pause here because I think one of the things that is, there's a lot of these types of stories, things disappear out of wallets, so on and so forth, right? And one of the reasons, I'll just share that I think these are really important stories for people to be aware of, but many people who defend blockchain will point out, but there's thefts, there's people who break into your home, there's bank hackers, there's any number of ways in which people attack systems that already exist. So what's at stake in understanding that the system isn't, let me say, foolproof for a moment, right? What is at stake for an artist or a collector or someone who's looking to get involved in this ecosystem in understanding the dangers that were just pointed out?
Well, I think when you talk about the parity sort of situation, although they did not do a hard fork in that situation, there have been other notable situations where there were hard forks and it went from Ethereum Classic to new versions of Ethereum. So one of the things, to answer your question, that a collector or an artist might be aware of is that from top to bottom, there are moments where this system is not fully flushed out yet. There's stress testing that's still occurring in this moment. Therefore, what you might think you're that you're participating in, or what you think the smart contract might be doing, even with the best developers that you can possibly get, might actually have a small glitch in it that they might not have anticipated. And so when you think about this, again, going back and saying this has to be for all time, how can you possibly plan for all time? There's no way. So that's something that you need to be aware of, that you can't overpromise and underdeliver, but you do, and you can sort of plan for it by getting the best people available and the best people on board to help you in creating those objects, and to sit down and think about, again, to Sarah's question, why are you doing this? What exactly is the final product that you want to bring forth as an NFT? And when you think about it from that way and work your way backwards, you're likely to follow as much of the safety protocols that you can to bring this to fruition. But with decentralized environments, inherent in them is that when that block gets minted, it's beyond your control to a certain degree. Okay, and when it's the beauty of blockchain, in that now we're seeing how that can be used for wonderful, amazing conceptual art, and that's also a risk.
I think that what's really important here is for artists to understand that you can't just pass off the responsibility or assume that somebody else is taking care of all of this stuff that is unintelligible or ununderstandable for everybody. You can't just plug and play at this point without thinking about the health of what it is you're creating. So, and by that, what I mean is, there is no insurance right now that you can get for NFTs. There's no centralized backup. I mean, the blockchain is supposed to be the ultimate backup, right? It can never be changed. It can never be hacked. But as an artist, what you want to think about is what is important about the work that you're creating. And if the image itself is important, make sure you have a backup. Make sure you provide the collector with a backup. You can send that image in whatever format it's created in. You can send that separately to the collector. They can have that on their computer, so it's not just what they're accessing through their NFT. So that, and again, this is not a replacement for the NFT, but in terms of backing up the work itself, you can look at those contractual obligations that you want to place onto the work, the rigorous underpinnings that all the conceptual thinking that goes into creating that work. That needs to be articulated and included with the NFT, certainly through these separate documents. But also, thinking about building that legacy of those artworks. How is it that you're going to maintain, archive, and control the way in which that work goes forward in the future? And I really think it's important that people start thinking about absolutely creating their own insurance, their own backup, so that if everything else fails, if things go awry on the blockchain, there's a way to re-access, remint, recreate what it is they put out there.
I mean, it certainly sounds, I mean, the warnings that you present certainly sound as if blockchain does not actually produce a fairer system than the one we have, that in fact it's extremely exclusionary given the knowledge base that is necessary. One of the necessary things for a fair market is that, all parties be able to be involved. And it does sound as if that's not the case here, unless you have this vast level of knowledge.
I think it's a system that's evolving and we have to just be cautious. I think that there is tremendous potential here, but it's important to understand that there is a tension between regulated systems and decentralized systems. The ones that we use now, I mean, we haven't even touched the issues of accessibility and environmental issues, but the systems that we have right now, say our banking system, has a whole lot of problems with it. There are a lot of issues, which is in part why these other decentralized crypto systems have been developed. That said, there's also some reliability that we can take from those banking systems that exist. We've got insurance on our accounts up to a certain amount of money. We've got regulatory bodies that try to make sure that people aren't getting cheated out of their money or taken advantage of in pyramid schemes or any other shady operations. We don't have any of that in the blockchain space at this point. To some degree, most people don't want to have anything like that, but at the same time, there is inevitably going to have to be some regulation and at least some standards and protocols that are developed. Otherwise, if it's a completely anarchic system, like we can't function like that. And there's, we need to have some reliability in order for it to be something that can truly serve the people that it should be serving.
And one of the ways that some of this reliability is trying to be introduced into the system is by analogy, right? By comparing something that is happening in this space to something that already exists that already exists either in the legal structure or so forth, right? So,
well, I mean, Erika brought up the example of Uber, and certainly we saw a lot of pushback when there started to be assaults that were happening in the Ubers, or not to pick on Uber, but with these rideshare systems in general, if you're not adhering to the standards that the taxis had traditionally required, insurance, background checks, everything else, and you start to have problems, then you start to see regulation coming into play, and you see the community saying, if this isn't a safe way for me to travel, I need to know either I'm going to go somewhere else, or I need to know that there are going to be systems coming into play that are going to make it safer for me. So we see it all the time in lots of different areas. We see it in terms of, regulations on employment situations, or health and safety around food, around drugs. I mean, all of these systems are in place to deal with dangers and problems that have come up in the past. The same thing is going to eventually happen in any environment that we're talking about. The question is, what role do we play in building that environment? What role do we play in establishing healthy systems, protocols, and standards so that we can maybe reimagine this space in a way that avoids some of the issues that have come up in the traditional systems.
sure.
How do we change?
I want to point out that when these are not new concerns, when the internet came to sort of power or rise, or at the turn of the millennium, all of these things were promises that the original internet had for the communities. And then it came into these centralizing organizations, and then issues like data collection we became aware of issues like data collection, which resulted in things like GDPR, right? So we see that same line that will happen exactly in this space. I think the real question in that growth is, just like with Uber, there was a massive sort of implementation project. And part of that was intentional on the part of the creators to move faster than regulation, to create an ecosystem where so many people were employed that if you were to regulate them out of business, that large economies would fall and revenue streams would fall. And so in this space, I am very encouraged by that, in the sense that so many young people are flocking to this space. This is giving a lot of hope to younger generations who haven't had a lot of breaks in the last, 20 years, thanks to the financial collapse and, the housing issues in 2008, and now with COVID. So this is really, I think, promising in that aspect. And I think we shouldn't be afraid of regulation. I think regulation is very good. It's meant to protect the people, like you said, who should have fair access to these tools that might allow their art to get greater visibility and access directly to collectors. I don't think that regulation will stop that. And then when that regulation comes, technology will have moved beyond that. And I'm curious to see what those next levels, and I think DAOs are that sort of next space where we're going to see these really interesting, constructs and communities and cooperatives come up.
I think it's really important to remember that move fast and break things, which is what we hear over and over again, works in some ways for innovation. It doesn't always work so well for artists.
I wonder if, just as a last sort of touch point before we open it up to the Q&A, I can bring it back to something that's terribly concrete for some of the people in the audience, which is when you sell a work through an NFT, there's these questions around copyright and who owns what in the space. Because it's an image, are you the artist, the person that anyone needs to come to if they want to display the work? Or is the collector, if it's a one-to-one work, the person who owning the asset, so to speak, is the person who must share it in the more traditional model, where like if you have the object, you're the one who has to be addressed to try and present it in a museum show or a gallery or whatever.
Well, you only have to be asked because you're the one who actually holds it. But the copyright issues don't change from the traditional art space to the online art space. The copyright is owned by the creator unless that right is transferred. And that again goes back to our conversation around contracts and are you licensing rights? Are you transferring rights? What is happening around the ownership of the actual underlying intellectual property in the process of creating and selling those NFTs? Without any other documentation or other arrangements, work for hire type situations, the artist owns the copyright, period. Whether that is something that is sold in a traditional space or something sold through NFTs, the artist owns that. What is interesting in the NFT space is that there tends to be a little more collaboration happening, whether it's between artists or with artists needing to use the assistance of animators or other designers to create the images that eventually are attached to the NFTs and then sold. So again, it really comes down to thoughtful practices in the way that I would recommend in the traditional world, applying in the same way in this digital space, being aware of who actually is the creator, making sure that those rights are articulated, and if there's any licensing happening, that needs to be done in writing.
So on that note, I think we will hand it over because I see that there's a lot of questions that have been popping up in the chat. And we want to try and get to some of them. Anya, I wonder if you want to start to take it over?
Yeah, we have a bunch of questions. And first I'm going to pass the mic over to Chust. Who said?
Thanks, it's Chust. Good try. It's
our
hard.
combo.
Yeah, I've taught copyright in law schools for 40 years. This NFT stuff is fascinating. I'm curious about your opinions of in the Armature itself, in the metadata. What in there is copyrightable and who might own it? And second, some of these NFTs, as you've already mentioned, the buyer of a chunk of an image has access to the image itself. And so it is potentially duplicatable, or it's possible even that they could, under separate cover, as it were, in an attachment somewhere, send a copy of the work to people who own an NFT. So are there copyright issues that you think of in the distributional aspects of the image built into an NFT, in addition to those that are in the Armature or NFT itself, the metadata? What in there might be copyrightable and who owns that? Thanks.
I think it goes back to it depends question or answer. Certainly, in terms of what is actually written into the metadata and what of that might or might not be protectable, there's, in addition to the actual creation of that information, there's the spirit and the ethos of Web3 that I think we have to sort of take into account and make sure that we're thinking about as this develops, which is this idea of open source, that there's a lot of sharing that goes on, and there's more of a spirit of not claiming ownership over certain things. So there's that we need to contend with. The other issue is that, as we talk about the development of standards and protocols, and that's really where the ERC 721 comes from, or impacts this conversation, is that if you've established protocols and you've established standards, then it's a little bit difficult to protect that work in particular. Again, I am not a coder, so I am not probably familiar enough with the actual things that go into developing each line of the code in the NFT, or in that smart contract or armature or whatever we're going to call it. I think that it's going to be difficult to get copyright protection for that. But that's an interesting question. It's, depending on what it is you're putting in there, is it something that is taken from elsewhere? Is there enough creativity that's going into developing that line of code to bring it to the level of being copyrightable? And then to your second question around the, let's just talk about it as artwork here, the artwork that's attached. There are issues that are similar to some of the case law that already exists around making copies of work and distributing those copies digitally. And that's where I want to distinguish what I was saying, or what I was suggesting, in terms of artists being aware of the potential challenges with NFTs and the future of NFTs, and making sure that there's some insurance in place, versus what collectors might do with that work. So certainly, any image that's attached to the NFT, let's assume it's copyrighted or copyrightable. It's not okay for the collector to be copying and sending that around. You're making derivative works every time you make a copy of that work. And so technically, there's certainly a violation when that happens. One of the bigger questions in this whole space is enforceability. How do you go after infringements? How do you deal with people who are creating unauthorized derivative works, whether it be in the form of right-clicking and sending stuff out, or in the sense of sending that NFT image? And I've seen companies popping up that say, make t-shirts with your NFTs. You can't do that legally. But the problem is, how do you go after people unless they've set up a website and you can shut it down with a DMCA notice, or figure out some other way to stop that marketplace from operating, or find an actual person behind it. But otherwise, wallet addresses are pseudonymous. You can't go after that wallet address. Maybe there will be some innovation at some point that allows for some method of enforcement through wallets. But at this point, that doesn't exist. So there are a complex web of issues around copyrightability, copyright protection, and copyright enforcement that absolutely are crucial to this conversation.
I wonder if I can just jump in here. It was one of the things that I think maybe also gets confusing is the fact that sometimes platforms gain rights to the images, right? So,
well, certainly you have the sort of Facebook, Instagram type terms that you're agreeing to without even necessarily knowing when you log on and sign up for that account. So yeah, I mean, we have to be cautious about that. I think that a lot of the platforms are a little bit more aware of that at this point, because there has been pushback, rather than simply taking those same standards that from traditional social media and pulling that into the NFT space. There's been a little bit more thought about it, but understand that ultimately those marketplaces are the ones that are vulnerable. It's OpenSea that's getting the takedown notices. And so, of course, they're a little bit more vulnerable, and definitely have to be thinking about these issues And so we are seeing some language that's not so wonderful in terms of what rights the artist is having to give up in order to operate on that platform. These are all things, again, that would be in that bucket of terms of service, the user-facing language that needs to be read and understood and interpreted before engaging on that platform, so that you know as a creator what you're giving up or not by participating.
Thank you, Sarah and Charlotte. Our next question will be coming from David Reinfeld, and you should be able to turn on your microphone.
Okay, am I going there? Okay.
Yeah.
Actually, before I ask my question, I just wanted to follow up on what you just spoke about before in your question. You haven't talked much about the patenting process, and I've spoken to my patent attorney about the NFTs in terms of looking at some kind of patenting, and he's done this before. He said, but it's in great, so I'm looking for some input from you. His view is that a lot of it is new and will be challenged, and it's not known what's going to happen. So his answer was, yes, we can patent certain things, but two, we don't know if they'll hold up. So what is your view on patenting process?
Well, I am not a patent lawyer, I will say that to begin with. But the standard is unique and non-obvious. And so the question is unique and non-obvious to whom? I think, so there are areas of innovation that certainly would be eligible for patenting. But there's also a lot of innovation that's already happened. So I think in some cases what we're seeing is people coming to the space from the perspective of just discovering it and thinking that they're coming up with innovations, whereas people who've been involved in the space for a long time have already been engaged in that process. And so, analyzing whether something is patentable or not is going to be a complicated issue. I, again, don't know enough about patent law to really speak to whether, generally speaking, there will be enforceable patents. I imagine there will be enforceable patents that come out of this. What they look like, I really couldn't guess.
Yeah, it's pretty much what he said. Anyway, my question was, is there some kind of sort of a reduced value NFT, which is not really meant to be a smart transaction for some kind of transfer of rights or ownership or any kind of selling, just something to register your artwork in bulk. And that's a less expensive manner that can constantly open up the NFT to keep registering your artwork, or is that not something that exists?
I'm not sure I understand exactly what the question is. Do you mean register in terms of putting your artwork onto the blockchain?
I wonder if I think this is an issue of like using NFTs as a form of provenance.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
So,
as opposed to a sales transaction. That's right. That's right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is what's going. There's a lot of conversation in the fine art world around the various uses for blockchain. And this is something that's been a conversation for a long time. How do you attach, if we're talking about digital art, it's much easier than if we're talking about physical art. So connecting physical art to the blockchain is a challenge that people have been working on for some time, and there are different innovations that are being offered and will be offered in the future. Digital art, being able to register digital art on the blockchain is obviously a little bit easier because you're talking about something that's natively in that digital sphere, and you don't have to worry about figuring out how to attach the physical object to something that is digitally registered. And yes, I mean, there are ways to do that. I think that this takes us back to the original question, though, which is why? Why are you doing it? And if you're doing it from the standpoint of wanting to put together something for collections management purposes or for legacy purposes, those are interesting explorations that I think you'll see coming to the marketplace, in the next months and weeks and years. Because I do think that as we get more familiar with this whole space, and as we get familiar with the idea of NFTs and blockchain as it relates to the arts, what we're going to see is, instead of all of these different areas, video games, music, movies, everything coming together in one space being called NFTs and everyone has to deal with it all together, it's going to start separating out into individual marketplaces so that the function of the NFT, I mean, look, the NFT is basically an agnostic package that helps to create a way to produce something that you can sell or keep track of. And so there are going to be innovations within the art space that are particular to the art world that appeal to and are accessible by people functioning in the art world. So I think as we see these things start to fall out into their different marketplace categories, we'll see market-specific innovations that will be aimed at collectors, artists, galleries, other players within the traditional art space. And Erika, maybe you can speak to this also.
Yes, so I want to bring up sort of a famous example that was Ernst & Young creating an NFT or putting the Mona Lisa on blockchain, and that was done, for certificates of authenticity and to create some identifying way if the Mona Lisa were to be stolen, to identify whether the one that was in front of you was the one that was in fact connected to this digital sort of asset. And this also goes into things like estate planning. I think there's a huge burgeoning area of estate planning law that talks about NFTs being added to trusts or into a business entity. The reason for that would be that if you put the NFTs into an entity, although physically they would not be in that entity as they're always kept on the blockchain, but if you create a sort of comprehensive inventory of all of the NFT pieces of your work, there are tax benefits to that, ease of transfer upon your death. So for artists planning, this is one of the things that I've been sort of getting into for my consultancy, is working with artists to work with teams of estate planning attorneys who are well versed in this space so that they understand what impact from a tax consequence having NFTs in your collection has on your overall financial situation, but also how you plan for passing this on either to a foundation that you might create or to heirs, and then working with boards of directors to determine valuations. That's another huge area that's going to come down the pipeline in the next couple of years. How do you value an NFT from an art perspective? Let's say that you were to sell it. The IRS tax consequences require you to create a value on the day that it was sold to determine things like cost basis and your tax consequences. And then when that person who purchases it goes to sell it later on their cost basis. And so in this way, not to go too far down the rabbit hole, you bring up a really great question that if artists want to create NFTs out of existing works, this does change potentially your tax structures and the way that you want to keep this from an archival perspective.
I think it's really important to understand the aspirational functions of blockchain and NFTs versus what can actually happen right now. And so it's great to have conversations around what would be wonderful to have, and that will help drive innovation to a large degree. But it's important to know what is actually possible right now. And that requires some understanding, again, of what the platforms that are accessible to your average artist, what are they actually asking for, what are they actually doing, and insisting on some additional transparency. We talk about transparency, but in fact, there's less transparency than one would like in the way that a lot of these things are working.
And how much all of that costs, because there are substantial costs.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, David, for your questions. And thank you, Erika and Sarah, for these answers. This has been so educational, and I'm sure many of us will be revisiting this conversation. Unfortunately, we don't have time for all of your questions, but I just want to say thank you to the audience for your questions and comments in the chat. And we can certainly download it and save these questions for taking a look later. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending all of our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Matthea Harvey, to the stage. Matthea Harvey is the author of 5 books of poetry and 2 children's books. She teaches poetry at Sarah Lawrence and lives in Brooklyn. So without further ado, please, Matthea, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Anya. Can you hear me? Is this working? Yes, okay. And thank you, Charlotte, Erica, and Sarah for that conversation where I learned a lot that I didn't know. I'm going to read, I think, 2 to 3 short poems. The first one is one that I wrote during COVID. I did not write a lot of poems during COVID. Instead, I made lots of tiny ceramic houses. But this was one poem that I wrote imagining getting back into an elevator. Elevator closed, elevator open. It's been eons since we met in lanes to admire each other's stamens, or even stood side by side in a stairwell. So forgive me if I blink blush here under the harsh LEDs. How would I describe the distant days? A motel menu offering only omelets, a stack of dusty drop cloths in a stalled moving van. Now, as we file in for our first journey together, even this choice of 14 floors floors me. I could write a novel about the elevator's control panel. At each stop, the door opens onto another shocked anemone face. We're all standoffish as thistles, but we try on pseudo smiles. I unfurl my fist into 5 frightened fingers. Apparently, we're all going up. No one presses emergency. No one presses stop. The next one is my only poem that mentions the law, so I thought I would read it. Life size is what we are, a new history of photography. Selflessly, the self gave it all away. Pin all your hopes, lay all your love, etc. Which means the fish that live in a plastic bag think the edges of the world pucker. It's one thing to make an image, it's 2 things to find one. Why weren't we mindful of the lady behind the makeup counter calling, "Come here, honey, let me give you some eyes." The laws were sunsetting. One puff of smoke rose in the minefield. People dragged their shadows along. I'm here to tell you that you're not. Surprise, darling, surprise. And the last one is a poem called How to Love a Landscape. And it's addressed to someone or something in the future. So we've kind of made the world into sort of difficult place for the future inhabitants. So this is writing to those people or creatures or whatever, maybe it's to bacteria. How to love a landscape. I don't know who I'm writing to. The child of a child of a child of a friend's child. A patch of algal phosphorescence inching towards eyehood. Whatever you are, I know you know we didn't try hard enough. Perhaps you found the bell jars labeled original atmosphere, secreted away inside caves, though surely a stalactite speared them long ago and the precious gases slipped away. Perhaps you found the ruins of the seed bank and scraped at it with your claws, wings, fins, paws. I'm incapable of imagining you. We were not good at imagining anything. We were busy putting money in our pockets, locks and more locks on our doors, building taller and taller walls, recording our accomplishments on our CVs, a list of why you should be given more money to put in your pocket. The moss tried in its mossy way, plumping up between pavers. The sloths kept carrying little landscapes on their backs as the forest burned. And a few things caught on with us humans. A video game called Eco Scenario, a tequila called Glacier Savior, which was regrettably served with glacial ice. If you found the libraries, I hope you found the libraries, you'll know we love to read how-to books, but no one ever read or wrote the right one. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Matthea, for such a wonderful reading to close out. And thank you, Erika, Sarah, and Charlotte for this conversation. We encourage everyone to view our archive of these conversations on our YouTube channel, where we'll upload today's event. And you can join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Byron Kim and Amanda Glubisi on the event of Byron Kim, Drawn to Water at James Cohen Gallery. We conclude that with a poetry reading by Shengying Fang. And you can now turn on your microphones to say thank you and goodbye. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Erica.
Very much.
Thank you, Anya. Thank you, Cal.
Thank you.
Hey, there's Fong.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.
I didn't listen to
informative.
it. I will later. Thank you guys. It was caught in the meeting all morning long. Gracias. Thanks for coming on.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah.
Everyone have a great afternoon. Enjoy your lunches.
Let's get some lunch. Thank you guys.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Lunch.
you.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.